Welcome to another virtual panel discussion from the Centre for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge. It is 26 years since the end of the Rwandan Genocide, which cost an unknown number of lives, up to 1 million, during 100 days, whilst the international community largely stood still. Tonight, our expert panel will be discussing the legacy of the genocide for mass atrocity prevention. I am Tom Peake, Research Associate at the Centre for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge, and I'm joined today by Ambassador Joyce Leader, Deputy US Ambassador in Rwanda during the genocide against the Tutsi, and author of From Hope to Horror with the University of Nebraska Press, which was released very, very recently. Ambassador Liberata Mulamula, visiting scholar and Associate Director at the Elliott School of International Affairs Institute for African Studies at George Washington University, former Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Tanzania, and former Tanzanian Ambassador to the United States and Mexico. She also served as the first Executive Secretary of the International Conference on the Great Lakes region. And finally, Devon Curtis, University Senior Lecturer in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Cambridge. And welcome also to our truly global audience. I encourage you to submit questions to our panel through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Just click it open, type in your question, and it will be sent through to our panelists. And please do note if your question is directed to a specific panelist or to the panel in general. And also please do leave your name and your university or other institutional affiliation should you have one. Now, before we turn to questions from our audience, I'll invite each of our speakers to say a few words, beginning with Joyce Leader.
Thank you, Dr. Peake, for inviting me to join this panel. I appreciate this opportunity to share with your audience some thoughts as a former diplomat that was in Rwanda in the early 1990s when the country was in the throes of transitions. One of the two transitions was from one-party authoritarianism state to a multi-party democracy, and one was from war to peace. These transitions dominated and framed everything that happened during that time, and I think that this buildup can help to the Rwandan genocide can help inform our efforts today to prevent future mass atrocities and genocide. So let me share with you about 5 or 6 thoughts on this. Genocide and mass atrocities are usually, in my view, an extreme response by a group or groups of people whose power and privilege are threatened by excluded groups that are seeking a seat at the decision-making table and full participation in the society. And these kinds of social transitions that Rwanda was in are inherently profoundly destabilizing, especially when they involve restructuring or reordering power relationships. And this is the case when you're democratizing, you're opening up the system to new participants. And it's the same with the peace process, where you're trying to work out some arrangement with your, quote, enemy. So when we're trying to help facilitate these kinds of difficult changes, it's important to be aware of the unintended consequences of our well-intentioned policies. In Rwanda, with each advance in democratization or the peace process, violence escalated. Hopes that were raised with the progress were suddenly dashed by the fear of the subsequent conflict. Our policy response to this violence, as diplomats, as the US, and in others in the diplomatic community, was to urge Rwandan authorities and politicians to work harder and faster to implement democracy and the peace process. Accomplishing these transitions, seeing them reach their conclusion, was our implicit conflict resolution strategy. We didn't recognize or acknowledge that our policies of support for democratization and peace were leading to neither democracy or peace. Instead, while helping perhaps to advance peace and democracy, our policies were actually helping fuel the violence, backlash from those resisting change who wanted to stick with the status quo. So what we needed was really some explicit strategies and policies aimed at preventing that conflict, to balance our policies and programs promoting change. Promoting democracy and peace without addressing the unintended, what we didn't expect, or should have expected but didn't expect, the backlash of the violence aimed at thwarting that change. If we weren't doing both, we could never have achieved sustainable democracy or peace. We needed a whole lot of peace building strategies and a whole lot of post-conflict thinking for pre-conflict problems in our toolkit. So one of the things that I conclude from this then is that we need to change the ways we think. And one of the things we need to change is, I think it's imperative that we make conflict prevention a priority in our foreign policy and our diplomacy. Now you say, well, don't you think about that all the time? Well, let's look at it. The crisis, the current default position is a culture of response to crises. We wait until they get almost out of hand before we do anything about them, and oftentimes that means some kind of military response. What I think Rwanda teaches us is that we need a culture of prevention of crises. We need to prioritize and foster this kind of culture. And to do that, we need to build support for resources, for preventive diplomacy. This means resources in personnel and funding, and they need to be upfront, on the front end of the problems rather than on the back end of the problems. But the challenge there is that it's very hard to obtain funding for something that hasn't happened or might not happen ever. When you just want to prevent something, that sometimes doesn't resonate with the policymakers, the ones that are holding the purse strings. And also part of changing how we think about things is to mainstream prevention policymaking and activities in our foreign policy process and our diplomatic work. This means to put some of this prioritization of conflict prevention into our regional bureaus, not just functional bureaus that are usually somewhat outside the policymaking process within our foreign policy establishment. Also, changing the thought paradigm will help diplomats and others be able to initiate prevention diplomacy early as part of routine diplomatic dialogue in conflict-prone countries and in conflict-prone regions. So not only do we have to change the way we're thinking about things, but we also have to change the way we work and organize our work in order to reach this, to institutionalize this culture of prevention instead of the culture of response. And part of that means improving the identification and response to early warning signs of problems. The presence of one or more warning signs doesn't mean that genocide is inevitable or mass atrocities are inevitable, but they should be a red flag for the policy makers that something is terribly wrong in that country. Also about changing our way to work is that we work is to improve the triage of hotspots at risk of escalation. I often think of it in terms of how would Rwanda, at what point in Rwanda's lead up to the genocide, would it have been put onto the watch list. And in fact, it's probably none of the things that were happening would ever have done that, as long as we defined our security interests the way we do as security of our nation, because Rwanda was so outside that. We need to start thinking about how we define that and how we can include humanitarian issues and humanitarian concerns in our definition of our security interests. I think COVID is one of the things that can also underscore that. And also we need to improve our policies and strengthen the programs for to address the kinds of issues that made genocide possible in Rwanda. Now, I have a long list of them here, and I won't have time to read them all or to go through them all, but I'll just highlight a couple. I think one of them that we have trouble dealing with is hate speech. How do we, that can sow such ethnic fear among ethnic and regional groups in a situation like this? And the question is, well, how do we really do this without infringing on our values of free speech, for example? Another one that's troublesome and that can cause people holding power to be able to commit abuses with impunity is the rule of law. That was missing in Rwanda. And this enables perpetrators to use their power to thwart change and have no accountability. It also is a problem to protect advocates of change who have no recourse to the rule of law. And the last one I want to mention is that I think is often left out of these equations when we're thinking about preventing mass atrocities and genocide, is that we need to go beyond humanitarianism to resolve long-standing problems of displacement of either refugees or internally displaced people. Too often the politicians leave this to the humanitarians. That's wrong. We need to be bringing the politicians and the policymakers and the idea of prevention into the resolution of longstanding displacement issues. And as a final comment, we need to improve our understanding of the history, the culture, and the relationships among groups in the society that we're dealing with, whether it's overseas or at home. And we also need to think in terms of the regional situation where that's applicable. So in my view, if we in the foreign affairs community could become more proficient and effective on the prevention end of the spectrum, the chances that our support for changes like democracy and from war to peace, which we're not too bad at, would be more likely to avoid a repeat of Rwanda's tragic slide into catastrophic mass atrocities and genocide. Thank you.
Many thanks, Ambassador Leader. And now we turn to Liberata Mulamula.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thomas and your team, for inviting me to participate in this distinguished panel on a very important subject matter, which is, I always say it is close to my heart because of my personal involvement in the peace efforts before, during, and after genocide in Rwanda. As you introduced me, I come from Tanzania. We border with Rwanda. During the genocide, we had refugees who fled to Tanzania at a place, and you might call here, and in the US, they call it a county. The refugees outnumbered threefold the local population. I come from that area. We had, we were about 300, but then we received 800,000 plus of refugees. So when I say it is personal, it's personal from that perspective that I experienced it, but also I've been working in that space for many years to ensure that never again that we see genocide in that part of the country. But Thomas, let me say, when you invited me and with this topic on the legacy of Rwanda genocide for prevention of mass atrocities, I was saying, yes, it's high time that we have a discussion focused on the prevention. But then when you talk of legacy, of course, what comes in mind for most people, it's about celebration. You celebrate about the achievements, you celebrate about one's life. On Sunday, I had my Tanzanian diaspora who live in the US, across the United States. They just decided to organize an event named Legacies of Ambassador Mulamula, the legacy of Ambassador Mulamula. And here I get an invitation to talk the legacy of Rwanda. I said, there's nothing to celebrate about Rwanda genocide. It was quite, of course, horrific. And the lessons, and this is, I think, the whole purpose of having this discussion. It is focusing on the lessons learned from this horrific incident, or historical perspective that happened into our region, which I was never experienced in that part of the world. So as explained by Joyce, I would like to bring to you that after genocide in Rwanda, where the international community just watched, when, of course, at the level of the United Nations, it was in action. They were haggling about what action to take. Of course, the General, Delaya will explain very well. But then the UN Secretary General then, Kofi Annan, having been so disappointed, so devastated, so he decided to go back to the Security Council and asked if they could have a resolution empowering him to seek regional solution, to seek homegrown solutions, having realized that they could not stop genocide and they could not prevent it from New York or even from Addis Ababa in the context of the African Union. So luckily, in 2004, the UN Security Council adopted 2 enabling resolutions with the endorsement of having an international conference on the Great Lakes region in seeking solutions, sustainable solutions, and ensuring that we never see genocide. Of course, if you read the resolution, the interpretation was they will have the normal conference that would be looking either in terms of the fundraising, pledging conference. No, Kofi Annan said, no, this is not about the conference. It's putting a mechanism that would bring all stakeholders in the region, including, of course, the leaders, to sit and be able to digest what led to this genocide in Rwanda, or what has been leading to the cyclic of violence in that region, because it didn't start with genocide in Rwanda. The genocide in Rwanda was like a climax. So he said we can use that as a platform, as an institutional mechanism to address that. So this is when everything was like brought back to the region because of the spillover effect. It started in Rwanda, but then as I mentioned about the refugees, but you had the entire genocide army in Interahamwe crossing from Rwanda to DRC. And this is what, in fact, what has stabilized the region until now. That's one of the instability that has caused instability. So I know, of course, we don't have much time to get into that history, but what I'm bringing to you is that the realization that whatever happens in that part of the region, Of course, Joyce mentioned the regional approach as where it is applicable. In that part of the world, it is full applicable. When there is a tension, everyone feels it. When I was asked to start up this sub-regional organization with the name of International Conference on the Great Lakes Region, we are saying it was based in Burundi. And then because we are looking at Rwanda, but in Burundi itself, it was a power cage almost blowing up. But then we are also looking at DRC. DRC was the epicenter that shook the whole region. So this is why I'm saying what I'm bringing to you is that they found there was no any other way other than bringing this in the context of the regional dimension. So having committed to that, we have the first ever summit that was held in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania in 2004 that brought everyone from the international community, from the region, the women, the youth, everybody gathered in Tanzania, having realized that we need now to address the problems, the ideology of genocide, the marginalization, the lack of governance, all of those. And those that came out to be the so-called, and it's known, and this is you are in the academia, look for it. The Dar es Salaam Declaration was a groundbreaking and the awakening that this is what we need to put to everyone seeking having lasting solution in that region. But then they were saying it was merely a declaration. There have been many declarations. Let's have a legally binding charter, a regional charter as the UN charter, but that is applicable to that region, very volatile region. And we went into negotiation for 2 years to have a legally binding, the pact, now known as the Pact on Security, Stability, and Development in that region. I'm bringing this because in that pact, there were about 10 protocols that were integral to that pact, very legally binding. And one of them, and which is relevant to today's topic, was the protocol on prevention and punishment of the crimes of genocide, the war crimes, crimes against humanity, and all forms of discrimination. It was one of its kind. Because all what was required, whether it's prevention, because we end on prevention, but then what about punishment? How do you fight impunity? How do you protect the victims or the potential victims? How do you define the crimes? Because even in the context of the International Criminal Court, they could not agree on those crimes, even definition of genocide. But then we said, we will define it and have it embodied in this legally binding instrument, the way we know it, the way we have seen it, the way we have experienced it. So this was one of the groundbreaking, it's one of its kind in the region. But then they were saying, because sexual gender-based violence, sexual violence was used as a weapon of, in Rwanda, but it has also continued to be used as a weapon of war. They said, we need to have another legally binding protocol that would prevent, would protect, would fight the crimes against these women, violence, the sexual gender-based violence. So these are the most critical, some of the, of course, there are also protocol on good governance, protocol on ending illegal exploitation of natural resources. So having adopted these protocols, they said, who is going to implement them? So they established, when I say they established, this was at the highest level, because we were trying to get the political involved. So we had established the regional follow-up mechanisms from the summit level to the women forums, to the youth forums, to the national coordination mechanism, that everybody was involved. So the focus was on establishing the structures, but also expanding the scope of responsibility for prevention beyond the government, bringing in the civil society, bringing in the faith-based organizations, bringing in the women, bringing in the youth, bringing in the business community as a collective responsibility to protect, to prevent, to punish. You must have heard, of course, recently that they were able to apprehend the mastermind of genocide, Felicien Kabuga. Took 26 years because of that impunity, but also having the international communities becoming like an accomplices. But then we said, as a region, we'll pursue. Of course, Rwanda pursuing, the region is pursuing, but eventually we might be able to get this. So these are the mechanisms that still exist. There are, of course, challenges in terms of in terms of implementation of these legal instruments, in terms of what, but it's what has cushioned. This is what has cushioned the region up to now. Because if there is anything that's happened, like in Burundi, when in the crisis in 2015, the region immediately, they don't wait for the enabling resolution from the UN Security Council to meet and decide on their action plan or what sanctions or whatever. So this is, I'm saying, it is a realization of thinking nationally, thinking regionally, but acting nationally. This is a process, a philosophy that has guided what we are seeing as the national and regional institutional mechanism for the prevention and ensuring that never again. So let me end here, maybe allow for further discussion and question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Liberata Mula. And finally, before we begin taking questions from the floor, and I can see we've already got a number of really good questions, so please do keep them coming. Turn to Devon Curtis.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this excellent panel. And I'm very honored to be part of it with these two other panelists who have had such direct experiences in the region and who have really both fought to make the region and the world a better place. So I'm very grateful to be here. What I wanted to do in these couple of minutes is really to zoom out a little bit. And I wanted to make three reflections on the question of what is the legacy of the Rwandan genocide on mass atrocities. And I guess my first reflection is really to do with this question of what does it mean for something to be a legacy, which I think when we think about the past is only ever understood through the present, as we're seeing now over debates over statues, colonial symbols, and artifacts, that politics of the past is informed by the present. So legacies, commemoration, the way we remember things, it's not just about the horrific events of 1994, but it's also about how we see the world today and what we want to see today and what we want to see in the future. And so then I think that also raises the question of, well, then legacy for whom? And I think, in Rwanda, there are multiple legacies of the genocide. So there's particular legacies within Rwanda. There's ways of thinking about the genocide. There's legacies in terms of domestic governance within Rwanda, in terms of foreign policy, in terms of community relations within Rwanda. There's also legacies, some of the things that Ambassador Liberata was talking about in terms of the sub-regional and continental architecture. So there are institutional legacies. And at the international level, there's also some institutional legacies, but there's also a symbolic legacy. And I think that Rwanda, the Rwandan genocide has really become a symbol, and a symbol of failure. And I think that the symbol that the Rwandan genocide has become internationally really shows that there's this, it's almost a moral absolute. There's this consensus or near consensus that, there is a consensus that this should never have happened. But the problem, I guess, is that politics is very rarely about moral absolutes. And so indeed, what came before the genocide and what has come after the genocide in Rwanda is actually contested terrain. That's where, it's contested politics. So both the previous speakers spoke about sort of the precursors to genocide in Rwanda, but there are big political debates and questions about the before and the after. And I think that that's actually why it becomes quite difficult to come up with a reliable system of preventing mass atrocities. Because even though everybody agrees that genocide is horrific and shouldn't have happened, the before and after is very contentious. So we can't, it's very difficult to agree. The second point I wanted to make is that in some ways, I think one of the most important legacies of the Rwandan genocide is actually the knowledge that it happened, that something as horrific as genocide can happen, even when most people don't want it to happen. And of course, there's a lot of academic research that shows that the world is becoming more peaceful, less violent over the past 100 years. There's optimists. So the fact that genocide happened and could happen is important, because genocide isn't about exceptionally evil people. And Rwanda certainly isn't an exceptional place, that genocide can happen under certain conditions. And I think, what we saw in Rwanda was that, and I think Ambassador Joyce Leader was talking about this, that there was a series of contingent events that led to genocide. It wasn't inevitable. There wasn't an inevitable march towards genocide in Rwanda, but there were contingent events and conditions that enabled this to happen. So I think it's important to recognize that these outcomes weren't inevitable, but they were possible. And so once we know that genocide can happen and these kinds of mass atrocities can happen, then it is about thinking about how to prevent these, what might seem as small steps, small violent steps from escalating. And of course, there are various things that we've been talking about, that various steps that can be taken. One is through punishment, international criminal law, sort of to act as a deterrent. Also, of course, through institutions and through new ideas and new structures. But all of these things, international criminal justice institutions, ideas and structures, those also are political, and that's why it's difficult sometimes to get agreement. And I guess that leads really to my third and final point, is kind of the need for humility faced with all of this. There's still some fundamental things that we just don't really know. And the first is that big question of really how to respond to violence. I think Ambassador Leader said, that a lot of focus has gone into that. Who can respond to this kind of violence? When is it appropriate to use violence against violence? And whose violence? And there's a whole range of political questions that emerge in that area about the legitimacy of violence and whose violence. But then there's also the more general question of, well, how can internationals and regional actors support political change? What is that appropriate balance between sovereignty and solidarity? Despite years and years of academic research and practice, I don't think we always have good answers to that question. How to support moderates in various countries without political interference? I think at the moment there's quite a lot of focus on punishment, punishment for crimes of sexual violence, punishment for atrocities. But then what about the larger structures that enabled this to happen? So for instance, should the focus be on instances of sexual violence, narrowly defined, or on structures of patriarchy that make this possible? And is it possible to actually focus on both? The problem with the first, just focusing on sexual violence, is it exceptionalizes this. The problem with focusing on the second, wider patriarchal structures, is that it's very difficult to do and very difficult to reach a political consensus over. So I suppose my overall point then is that, thinking of legacies is quite challenging. And I think that the way to start is to think about the Rwandan genocide not as a single exceptional event, but instead as a horrific culmination of a series of contingent events. And maybe that helps us begin to get away from simply a focus on military intervention, punishing perpetrators, punishing sexual violence, which all are important, but maybe it helps us think about some of the broader questions of structural violence, of patriarchal systems, the way in which ethnicity does or does not gain salience and might be mobilized for violent purposes or not. And some of the bigger issues of social justice that actually we are all over the world now thinking about right now, and which ultimately I hope and I think can lead us to a different kind of world. Thanks.
Many thanks, and thank you to all for your wonderful interventions. And again, just a reminder to the audience that please do just send questions through the box at the bottom of the screen, and mention if it's for a specific panelist or for the panel in general. Please do leave your name or and your university or other institutional affiliation, should you have one. And just to say, we'd stay with Devon for the first point of discussion here, and picking up on something you mentioned. It's a very timely discussion we're having here, given the recent developments in France, which we're all aware of. I wonder, given the symbolic resonance of the Rwandan genocide, how vital is it specifically to continue actively pursuing justice so many years later for the large number of existing suspects living around the world? And we've also had another question, which from a member of the audience here, from Andrew Wallace, as formerly of Cambridge University, who kind of adds on this. He said, is the current rise of genocide denial with regard to Rwanda directly correlated with the failure of the international community to bring to justice the perpetrators, not only in the immediate aftermath of the tragedy, but still today? So perhaps if Devon wants to take this one first, and then of course we can.
Yeah, I think on the question of justice, I think of course it is absolutely important. I mean, it's vital to think about accountability, and certainly thinking about justice and international criminal justice is a way of thinking about accountability. I think, though, it is also important to think about justice more broadly, and not only to fall into the trap that the only way to think about justice is through international criminal law, right? So I think to think about other things, reparations, certainly, I mean, the gacaca system in Rwanda, that has been criticized as well, but I mean, it was another way of thinking about justice, thinking about restorative justice, thinking about amnesties. I mean, these aren't all necessarily appropriate in the context of Rwanda, but I think we do have to think more broadly about justice and not simply see this only as international criminal justice in this kind of narrow way. So sometimes that is appropriate to think about it in terms of international criminal justice, but there's many other ways of thinking about justice, and there's many other examples of countries and communities that have thought about justice in different ways. And it really is about, I think, what kind of society is being built, and justice and rule of law is always a part of that, but it might look quite different in different contexts. I think that the question, though, from Andrew about genocide denial, I think this is really worrying, and I think, I mean, he knows as well as I do that one of the really disappointing and challenging things is the way in which at least the academic scholarship on Rwanda has become very divided. And unfortunately, I think I'm beginning to see the same thing happen in Burundi. And I think that's really too bad, because there isn't much discussion, and both sides actually, are so polarized. And I think it actually can lead to quite dangerous outcomes. And I think actually this kind of extreme position of genocide denial is a reflection of that. And I think actually that's why academics really have to take responsibility for the type of work that they're doing, responsibility for their work and the consequences of that work.
Joyce, if you would like to comment on the role of international justice, and specifically in the context of Rwanda.
Thank you. I think that Devon's made some good points about thinking more broadly about justice, but I do think myself that the extent to which the people who have already been indicted and have been charged with the crimes of facilitating and acting on and creating the genocide in Rwanda, I think it's very good that they're still being pursued, and I think that the fact that Felicien Kabuga was arrested in May one of the financiers of the genocide. I mean, I thought he was going to live out his life in Kenya. I had no idea he was caught that he'd be caught in Paris. But I think it was a relief to many people that this person who's still denying that he had any denying that he had anything to do with it, or that taking any responsibility for the use of his money, at least to enable such dastardly deeds, is something that we should cheer about, that we should feel there's one side that you can take a little bit of relief there. But there's still 6 more people out there that are on the list, and it would be very comforting, I think, for those people to also see the criminal justice, international criminal justice, they get their accountability through international justice. But I think it's important to explore these other ways of making sure that things can't happen again, and I think all of that then becomes part of the justice that the people can take heart in. I mean, I know that I'm part of a non-governmental organization that's trying to help women who were victims of sexual abuse during the genocide. And I mean, it's been 26 years, but the children that they bore are just coming into their adulthood and suffering with many kinds of problems, as the women have been suffering all along with being shunned and so forth. So it's just that there's so much more to be done to bring about the feeling of accountability having actually taken place for so many of the people who were involved in one way or another with this horrendous experience. Thank you.
Thank you. And Liberator, I hope you'll excuse if we move to another question, staying with you, before giving you an opportunity to also weigh on in this one.
Oh,
this comes from Naman Habtom, who's in the Faculty of History here at Cambridge.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, do Rwanda's interventions in the Congo since 1996 impact our understanding of mass atrocity prevention? And has this undermined the efficiency or the perceived legitimacy of some of the initial lessons following the Rwandan genocide?
I don't know whether I got the question well, but as I mentioned, because what happened in DRC, of course, was a spillover effect from the genocide in Rwanda, but the DRC is also another completely different territory. What has been happening there until today, I mean, in whatever definition you give it, it is horrific. And Devon spoke about this sexual-based violence as being focused, but in different contexts. But in that part of the world, one, it is the region or the place that is littered by the armed groups, since, of course, the fleeing of the genocide there, but there is multiplicity of the militia, multiplicity of, we call them negative forces. And these ones are they are not under any one radar, however much you try. And of course, this is also a very vast place where you can, I mean, it's just like you are looking for a needle in a, I mean, but there are so many. And as we are talking, and with this COVID-19 situation, nobody's paying attention. So they are multiplying. They are committing all sorts of crimes. And I don't know why. Usually the targets are the women. And as we're also talking, these same negative forces, the armed groups, because we have been calling, said, what sustained these groups? That's when you find the issue of the natural resources, because they are in the area where you have the best minerals in the world. And the government, of course, doesn't have the capacity even to be able to patrol those areas. They don't have the army that is disciplined. They have the business people who work with this. So there is all sorts of things going on. so sorts of crimes. And when they call DRC as a capital city of rape, but when I was looking at the statistics, of course, say in South Africa, every other minute, there are more women that are more raped than maybe in DRC. It's because somebody is following. There you don't even know what's going on. But that's where everything, even when you talk of justice, that is also another hideout of the criminals that have committed offenses whether in Tanzania or where, and then they run to especially the eastern part of DRC. So this is, I remember when there was, this was an American who was leading the UN, the biggest peacekeeping force in DRC office. And he went to the Security Council making a plea that can you please pass a resolution that will ensure there is zero tolerance to the crimes against humanity that are being committed in the DRC. So that will follow with the enforcement mechanisms. I tell you, since we celebrated that the Security Council came up with a very enabling resolution to ensure that this cannot be tolerated. But throughout the years, it's been zero tolerance, zero attention. So it continues as ever in a cyclic manner. So I'm saying, I don't know what the question was, but I'm saying, if we talk of DRC, we need another session. We need another session to do justice to what's going on in that part of the world. So let me end it there.
I think the DRC requires far more than one more session, actually. And I'm sure actually we will probably hold one in the near future. And staying with you briefly again, we have another question from Cambridge from Robert Moore. Given that you've emphasised the regional approach,
yes.
How can the international authorities best support this?
Yes, the international community, of course, when you talk of the international communities, we talk in terms of the institutions that exist, that were supposed, of course, to support these regional institutions, regional mechanisms. For example, the United Nations, in its charter, as a specific provision that they recognizing the role of the regional organizations. But then what I see is like, it's done, if at all there's collaboration, cooperation is always on ad hoc basis, very superficial kind of support that they get, but they recognize, especially when there is a crisis, when there is a mess, they go to the regional institutions because they are considered as very close on the ground, that they can move in fast, but then the politics, the dynamics of the region, it's always also difficult, even with the international community, to know who they are dealing with. But also the international community, which we see as external actors, they are even ready to complicating the situation even more. Because sometimes you'll find we are talking about fighting, maybe even these armed groups, but then they are being supplied arms by its people, companies, and nobody, in fact, even at the level of the UN, they have the biggest peacekeeping force in the world and the most expensive to maintain in the world. I always, when I was in the Great Lakes, I said, if they could give me just 1/3 of that money that is being used to sustain that force, to invest it in the mechanism, whether it's judicial, whether it is racial, whether it is women empowerment, it will have more impact than that. So the international community is there, it's a support, but sometimes it's a longer approach they will take. They come with prescribed solutions that are not applicable. Maybe they were applicable in the crisis in Sri Lanka, and then they bring it to the Great Lakes region. It doesn't, or it is just too little, too late. It doesn't excite the international community when everything is quiet. But when there is a crisis, there is a stampede, but it's usually very late, very late. But finally now, what we are pursuing, I'm part of the Secretary General's team on looking into the peace building architecture review. So the focus now, and this is, I hope that's what will now be able to define the narratives, is working to seek local solutions, working with the local and national actors. And of course, most important, to have ownership of whether it's interventions, whether it is legal instruments. That ownership by the people in the region or in the country is what we are now seeking to have they call it people-centered and inclusive approach that will fit. So I hope that might change the kind of intervention and support that the international community brings through these regions.
Thank you. And now coming on to Joyce, and of course you can touch on that as well, but something we discussed is the terrible sexual violence that was observed in Rwanda, and arguably in the decades since, that one of the more positive responses of the international community has been the recognition of the need to introduce specific policy interventions to protect women in these cases, and the Women, Peace and Security agenda has moved forward. What more needs to be done?
Well, I really can't say because I haven't been following that closely, but I don't know. I really don't know. There are some, I only know about some non-governmental organizations that have been working in the area to, at the very local levels, to try to end these abuses. And I think maybe they've made some progress. There's something called the advocacy group. I think it's the advocacy group. Anyway, I think that I don't really know the answer. I mean, it's got to have big picture and little picture all at the same time. Set the frame and have the people in the local level working on this.
Now we have a question for Devon from Rory, who is an alumni of the MPhil in African Studies at Cambridge. And he asks, how do you take on the superstructures of social injustices, such as patriarchy? What are the first steps? And how do you make that challenge less daunting to policymakers and civilians alike? So that's two very big questions, one after the other.
Yeah, those are excellent questions, and I wish we all knew the answer to them. You know, I'm actually kind of encouraged by some of the things that are happening in the world right now. I think that people are saying, you know, enough is enough, that actually there are these big structural inequalities, racial inequalities, gender inequalities, and that, you know, that these need to be addressed, and that it's not enough to keep saying that they will be addressed at some point, that actually they have to be addressed. And of course, these inequalities look different in different parts of the world, or like they manifest themselves differently in different parts of the world. But actually, you know, what has been interesting, for instance, in the Black Lives Matter movement is that, of course, it looks different in the US and in Kenya, but actually we're having this conversation across the world. So I think that that's kind of a hopeful thing. I suppose in terms of how, you know, the more concretely how to address it, and I guess I'll link it to the previous question about sexual violence, because, you know, I think a lot of the research shows that, you know, sexual violence is sometimes used as an instrumental tool in warfare. And actually Amnesty had a campaign a few years ago called, you know, rape is cheaper than bullets. So to instill fear in populations, to clear out different populations, that, you know, rape is effective. It's an effective tool of war. And so I think that, you know, that is an important way of thinking about sexual violence. But also we have to think about, well, what makes this effective, both violence against women, but also violence against men. It has to do in part with ideas of masculinity and of femininity and women's equality. So I think that actually programs that will focus on, that do focus on women's equality and women's voice and women's participation in an indirect way will also address questions of sexual violence, or could address questions of sexual violence. So I think that, you know, that both need to happen, the large picture and the sort of smaller, more targeted interventions.
Thank you. And I'm conscious of the time, and so sorry we're not letting everybody get to every one of these. But we've had a question which I'd like to bring back to Joyce, when we're kind of talking about the diplomatic response. Arguably, R2P couldn't be seen as the prime diplomatic response of the international community. And we have a question from James Mile, also at Cambridge. As the main legacy of this, did the Western powers ensure by their actions in Libya that it would no longer be taken seriously? So do you see the R2P as still a central kind of diplomatic tool for addressing these issues which we've discussed today?
Well, I think that's a very important question. I think that the experience of applying it in Libya was kind of shocking to the people that applied it as well as to the world. That once you had flipped the power, so to speak, what do you do? What do you do with the residual pieces of that power? I think that, though, that it's very important to try to continue to keep this concept that there's a responsibility that the international community has for stepping in where countries themselves cannot or will not protect their people. But I think we do need some more deep thinking about how that can happen and what the consequences of actually doing it are. I don't think it's an outmoded concept. In fact, in some ways, it's even more important as time goes on. But I think it's a question of trying to work with how that concept can actually be operationalized. And I know that that thinking is going on somewhere, but I'm not quite I'm not privy to it at this point. But I think it's an important thing to keep alive.
Thank you. And we could talk about this subject for much longer, but unfortunately it's now time to bring a close to this video panel on the legacy of the Rwandan genocide for mass atrocity prevention. I would like to thank all of our audience for your many delving and thought-provoking questions. Thank you very much for being engaged. And thank you again to our panelists, Ambassador Joyce Leader, Ambassador Liberata Mulamula, and Devon Curtis. And please do check back shortly on the Centre's website at www.cfg.polis.cam.ac.uk, where the video of this discussion will soon be posted. And I hope that you'll also be able to join another of our upcoming video panels in 2 weeks, on Wednesday, the 15th of July, at the same time, 6 p.m. here in the UK, for our final panel in this series before the summer break. We'll be discussing Indigenous peoples and the responsibility to protect with Nadia Rubai of Binghamton University's Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention, Karine Duhamel of the Canadian Museum of Human Rights, and India Reid Bowers, who is founder and director of the International Organization for Self-Determination and Equality. Thank you again from all of us here at the Centre for Geopolitics, and we hope that you can join us then.